interpretation. You also have the ability to pin that particular box so that that person can be enlarged and be the main person on your screen, so you can have easier interpretation instead of looking at one of the smaller squares on the screen. As well, we have Spanish language interpretation tonight, and I am going to now kick it over to Christina Barbosa of Washington County to share information about how to join the Spanish language channel. Christina, are you there?
Yes, thank you, Marcus. Gracias por acompañarnos esta tarde. Para acceder a esta reunión en español, únase al canal en español moviendo su curso al siglo mundial en la parte inferior derecha de su pantalla. Para hacer preguntas en español, escriba su pregunta en el cuadro de chat y las personas interesadas tendrán la oportunidad de hacer una declaración de hasta 2 minutos en voz alta. Si es necesario, su declaración será traducida en inglés. Gracias.
Thank you, Christina. And again, we're going to give it about 20 more seconds and then we're going to get going. But while we are waiting, in fact, time is up. We're going to get going. I want to honor everybody's time tonight and make sure that we have time at the end for some good, rich discussion, which is the point of this gathering tonight. So a few logistics. You learned about the ASL. You learned about the Spanish. For those of you who do want to comment at some point later in the program, there will be opportunities for that. Please explore your raise the hand function. If you have comments prepared now, or if you wish to talk later once you've heard some of the budget presentation tonight, I encourage you to raise your hand and the county clerk will be taking in order the number of people who wish to speak. We are going to try to get as many residents as possible an opportunity to speak. So much like normal commission meetings, we will be limiting comments to about 2 minutes each, because we want to hear from as many residents as possible. And after that portion, there will still be an open discussion portion where, again, I encourage anybody who's interested in sharing their thoughts with their commissioners to lift up and raise their hand. So before I introduce you to your commissioners, I did want to give a couple of basics about why we're here tonight. And that is that we're here today to learn the basics of the county's budget overall, and then talk about the specific proposed budget for fiscal year 20 and 21 as prepared by county staff. Further, we're here to help share and hopefully align the values and priorities of us, the county residents, with the county's commissioners, where they should invest more, where they should invest less, etc. And just some grounding principles. Budgets are planning documents. As COVID taught us, plans change, so we have to have flexible budgets. But no matter what else is going on, the budgets will reflect the choices that the county has to make, priorities, values, accountability, allocating scarce resources. And one thing that is going to be reiterated a few times is that county budgets have to balance. And there has to be a decision process around that. So you're going to hear all that today from your commissioners and particularly from your Chief Financial Officer, Jack Leong. The last thing I will say about budgets is both personal budgeting and government budgeting involve an ongoing process of balancing multiple needs and wants. You know, both have two types of spending to consider: fixed expenses and mandatory spending. That's the fixed expenses, and then flexible spending in a personal budget versus government's discretionary spending. I'm not going to talk too much about budget principles. That's what your Chief Financial Officer is for. So if you would, Kevin, could you throw up the slides, the slide deck? Kevin or Chuck, I'm sorry. I just wanted to run through slides 1 through 9 very quickly, and then I will throw it over to your commissioner. Next slide, please. These are just the dates. Today is the 12th, of course, and we're going through this, but there are 3 more opportunities if you are not able to speak tonight to join in the community investment conversations. And I would encourage you to join us and to encourage your friends and colleagues to join us in the future. Next slide, please. The way we're going to engage tonight is, and I encourage you, everybody's tired of Zoom world, but please try to stay engaged, listen to understand. Please speak your truth often and responsibly, expressing your values without diminishing the values of others. And we know that talking about money and budgets isn't easy, but have compassion for those who do and accept non-closure. This is only one step of the process. Thanks. Next slide, please. You're going to hear from your Chief Financial Officer at the county, Jack Leong. He's going to walk you through Budget 101 and then specifically talk about the budget for 2021. And he'll be able to answer all questions about that. Next slide, please. Purpose of tonight, you've heard it a couple times, but to share information about the budget, to hear from the community, and to advance the center community need in the development of short and long range budget planning. Next slide, please. And this is a conversation, but you're going to hear specifics about the budget. In fact, we'll skip over that. I'll let Jack handle all that, and we'll go on to the next slide, please. One back, please. That's good. We're going to have the conversation. We're going to get overview, feedback, and then center on community needs. That's the most important thing here. Next slide. And some of you tonight may have come expecting participatory budgeting. We just wanted to be clear. Participatory budgeting is when a community comes together to jointly decide how to allocate the public budget. This is a little bit different. This community investment conversation is an opportunity for the board to hear from the public as the board develops their short and long-term priorities. And while participatory budgeting is designed to serve as a forum to advocate for specific changes to the budget, this process tonight and for the next 3 sessions after this is intended to help provide the board insight into your community need as they consider direction for budget development. It's a nuance, but it is important that you understand the board makes the ultimate decision, but they make it informed by you in the community. Next slide, please. And what's on this slide is if you do not get your questions answered either by your commissioners or by your CFO as part of the process tonight, you can reach out directly to the CFO at this address, directly to the county clerk, where they will be chronicling every question that you ask and providing a public FAQ, frequently asked questions. So if you asked a question that didn't get responded to, they will post it with the question and the answer. And the BCC, the last address, is directly to your Board of Commissioners. And they are all anxious to hear from you. And because they're anxious to hear from you, I'm not going to talk anymore. What I'm going to do is introduce the chair of the County Board of Commissioners, and that is your chair, your elected chair, Catherine Harrington. Thank you for joining us tonight, Commissioner Harrington, and thank you for calling this meeting. Take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Mundy. I really appreciate it. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. Gaining community input early in the process of developing our next year's budget year is relatively new for us. This is just the second time in 2 years for us to try being far more open and transparent, along with engaging with you. So thank you for learning and doing with us. We truly are doing this together. Last year, we were able to go through this together in person, which allowed for slightly more intimate conversations. This year, we've really been embracing new techniques to continue our learning process together. I'm thrilled that we are doing this, that we are learning together more as your board and as a full agency so that we can better fulfill your needs in serving you, our community. I want to save time for the presentations as well as the engagement. So right now I'd like to turn it over to my commission colleague, Commissioner Jerry Willey. Take it away, Jerry. Tell us a little bit more, or Commissioner Willey, sorry. Tell us a little bit more about your thoughts on the budget and your priorities.
Thank you, Chair. I am excited to be here. This is, as you stated, this is the first of 4 for this particular year. My district is District 4. That's primarily Cornelius Pass West, and a large area of it is rural area. My district touches 4 different counties. So it's as we head west and south and north, we interact with a number of other counties, also 6 cities, 3 of which are, of course, rural cities. So I'm very happy to represent that part of our county. And first of all, I guess I would like to say thank you very much. We appreciate the support you demonstrated in supporting our public safety levy back in May, and as well as the library levy. We appreciate the fact that you take voting as a serious part of your engagement with our county, and so thank you for that, and also for your vote in November. That was extremely important. We're very happy, and Catherine may reflect on this a little bit later, but we're very happy to welcome a new county commissioner, Nafisa Fee, and she was elected in November. So welcome to the County Board of Commissioners, Nafisa. And she is replacing Commissioner Dick Scouten. And Dick has been on the board a very long time, and we're going to miss his expertise and certainly his history on the commission. So Dick, thank you very much for your commitment to Washington County, and we'll watch forward to see. We really don't believe you're going to retire, but we'll wait and see. As a commission, we've been very blessed to have CARES money allocated directly to us, about $104 million. I don't have nearly the time to go in and talk about what all we did with that money, but we've took a good portion of that money and dedicated it to trying to keep our businesses healthy, specifically our small minority-owned businesses. And so we've been focused on that for the last several months of how we can work with our cities and our urban unincorporated areas, certainly our rural businesses as well, as to how we can help support them through this very tough pandemic economic time. So we've been focused on that. And if you have any questions or comments about that, please send us an email and we'll make sure that that you can get that information. There's a lot there. And lastly, one of the things that has also been highlighted and emphasized during this pandemic is our educational divide. Our kids are all trying to learn virtually, and that requires a strong internet system, and we don't have that in our rural communities. And so we are working hard with our state legislature, our federal as well, to provide a stronger rural broadband. So all I can say there is stay tuned, but that's certainly a high priority for me in District 4 and our county commission. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Willey. And Marcus, I think we are ready to have our CFO, Jack Leong, take us through Budget 101.
Thank you, Chair. One quick set of reminders. I wanted to share with the group that the Q&A, the question and answer, if you have questions along the way, you can pop it into the Q&A. You'll see a button at the bottom of your screen, and county staff will be monitoring that and making sure if your question can be answered tonight, it will be answered, and if not, it will be posted on the Q&A. The second thing, I wanted to remind you, be thinking about questions you might ask in the later section that we're going to have. And if you want to raise your hand, again, the county clerk will be getting people in order. The third thing is that I would say it's just the county commissioners want to hear from you tonight. So please be brave. Even if you're reticent to speak tonight or you're not used to public speaking, please share your opinion. They do want to hear from the residents. And the last thing is I will ask Christina, if there's something to share in Spanish with those who might have joined late, this will be a great opportunity before we get Jack going.
Yes, thank you. Para que los han acompañado tarde esta tarde, gracias por acompañarnos. Para acceder a esa reunión en español, únase al canal de español moviendo su curso de signo mundial en la parte inferior derecha de su pantalla. Para hacer preguntas en español, escriba su pregunta en el cuadro de chat. Las personas interesadas tendrán la oportunidad de hacer una declaración de hasta 2 minutos en voz alta. Si es necesario, su declaración puede ser traducida a inglés. Gracias.
Gracias, Christina. And now, the exciting Jack Leon.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Thank you, Chuck, for rolling to the next slide. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jack Leon. I'm your Washington County CFO, and I am very excited to be providing another iteration of the county's budget overview to you as a part of our community. Now, if you were part of our group, our live group last year, you will see some of those repeat informations. But let me tell you that every year we try to reinvent ourselves a little bit, adding a little more relevant information and try to really make sure that we bring the most relevant, most useful information to you in this setting. Thank you, Chuck. Let's get to the next slide, please. So a couple points that we will be hitting in this part of the presentation tonight is that we're going to go through some of the county budget basics, and starting with the budget guideline and the guidance, and then as well as what are the types of funds that the county has, which is really hitting the county's budget structure. And then moving on from that is we also talk about our operational areas, which as a county, we call them functional areas. So essentially, what are the service areas that we spent the county's money on? And then we will talk about how the budget is developed, go through the whole process in a timeline perspective, as well as we will do a deep dive into the fiscal year 2021 budget overview. And then obviously, all of that is driven by the Washington County's mission, is what we do. And the Washington County's mission is to provide excellent and cost-effective services that support healthy, peaceful, safe, and sustainable communities, and encourage meaningful participations in the community activities and the county governance. Next slide, please. So to start off with the budget basics, we have to look at the guidance. Is what guide our budget process? There is actually very specific Oregon laws that guides that. It's specifically ORS, which stands for the Oregon Revised Statute 294.305 to 294.565. This is the set of statutes that actually guides our county's budget process. It's actually very interesting reading if you're in my line of profession, but to our common folks, oftentimes that can be very dry material. So, but now that you have a contact at the county, you can feel free to shoot me any questions if you ever have any question about the Oregon's budget law. And then next, besides the Oregon law, we also have the county's charter and codes, which is the county's decision as the establishment of the county to decide on how do we handle our budget, including having a CFO, having a treasurer, and then having the board being part of the budget committee. All of that is documented in our charter and codes. And then lastly, but not least, is the Board of County Commissioners' directions and priorities. And that is actually both on a short-term, year-to-year basis, as well as a long-term strategic planning horizon basis. And just like Marcus has mentioned, that all of these directions and priorities are actually developed by the commissioners' regular engagements with the community, and then the commissioners' understanding of what the community's most need is. And move on from the guidance, let's talk about the fund, is how do we structure it? So the county's first level of structure of the budget is by funds. And those, you can think of those like checkbooks. For our common folks, usually we have only a few accounts, like we could have a checking account, have a saving account, do our regular spendings in the checking account, some of our savings and reserves in the saving account. County is very much like that, except that the county's portfolio is larger. So we have more funds than just a handful of them. So each fund acts like a separate account for us to ensure that those things are segregated and activities are segregated in each fund. So it is a legal segregation of the county's resources and expenditure. Whenever, if we ever run into the need to move any resources from one fund to another, there is actually this public budgeting process that we have to go through, ensure that we have a public opinion to move things in between funds. Now, currently, the county's budget includes 81 different funds. That includes 1 general fund and 80 special funds. So the general fund, you can consider that as your general spending checking account, which is anything that doesn't fall particularly into a specific purpose can go in and out of that fund. And then all these 80 other special funds are actually very specific purpose funds that each one of them carries a very dedicated purpose and a very dedicated revenue source as well. Next slide, please. So as I was mentioning, the general fund is a catch-all fund that accounts for the county's discretionary resources and associated expenditures. So the discretionary resources could be our property tax that the county collects, certain fees that the county collects, and essentially anything that doesn't have any external restrictions or internal commitment that ties to a particular purpose. So that's the discretion. Each year, the spending is at the discretion of the county's directions. And then the special funds, usually they're used to segregate dedicated resources. And no matter this dedicated resources, examples could include federal grants that we receive or state funding that we receive, or sometimes it can be a very specific revenue source. For example, if there's a certain kind of fee that we collect to conduct particular any specific kind of services, those are categorized in the special fund, and those are usually has an external constraint to those. So that's the high-level difference between general fund and special fund. Next slide, please. And then let's talk a little bit about the functional areas. So the fund is one way for the county to allocate our resources and essentially our financial means. And then, of course, the county goes into all of these other areas and turns our resources into services. So on the operating side, the county has 5 general functional areas that support the county's operations. And this chart illustrates it. Starting from the left to right, we have a general government, we have a public safety and justice, we have a land use and transportation, housing, health, and human services, as well as cultural education and recreation. Many of these are actually special funds. So just to give you some examples, it's that most of our general government and the public safety and justice actually falls under the general fund side. You can see that in this chart, the assessment and taxation, the county auditors, the county council, emergency management, all of that, like our regular general services, falls under general fund, and as well as a good portion of our public safety. And then for land use transportation, a good portion of the housing, health, and human services, cultural education and recreation, because there used to be some very specific funding sources for each one of these operating areas. Many of those are supported by special funds and the dedicated funding sources. And we will go into this a little bit deeper when we go into the fiscal year 2021 example. You can see more live view of what I mean by that. So next slide, please. And then besides the operating functional areas, the county also have some non-operating functional areas. A very classic example of that is the capital funds. Our capital funds include 3 areas in general: the transportation capital funds, the facilities capital funds, and then the information technology capital funds. You can consider those almost like if you're working on a home project and then you're putting money away to use that resources to finance the home projects that's down the road. That's the purpose of this capital fund. And because the county is continuously in that regular process, so we actually don't let this fund sit for a while. They actually continue to recur and turn within those capital funds. And then we have the non-operating functional area. That is where the county's insurance funds are, the debt service funds, and then as well as some miscellaneous reserve funds are in those in the non-operating functional area as well. And last but not least, we have the non-departmental functional area. That is the majority of that particular functional area is where the county's contingency, a part of the county's contingency resides. Next slide, please. So now let's talk a little bit. We have understand the basic structure of the fund, the functional area. Let's talk a little bit about how does the county's budget come to form. So it's literally actually a year-round process. For us to get to adoption in June of 2021, for example, we actually start the process in July. So from July to September 2020, that's where we do a lot of preparations. That's where my team actually gets very busy to set up the New Year's structure, working with the departments, and then get our softwares rolled forward to the next year so it's ready to take in information. So there's actually a lot of logistic and prep work that goes on from July to September. We also work out a detailed budget calendar that has a full calendar that documents each step of the way and then all the deadlines to manage that whole process. Going into the second fiscal quarter of the year, the October to December 2020, that's where we start to work with the county commissioners, work with the county administrative office to set priorities. So that's the time of priority setting, the time for the budget development starting to begin. And that is actually particularly the reason why we're having the community investment conversations right here, right now, is so the county commissioners can hear a lot of your input, can hear a lot of the community's priorities. So it can all be incorporated into the budget priority setting. And that is why we have this at this time. So in a way, this is actually the very beginning of the budget development process, and you are actually getting involved at the very beginning of the budget development process. And then going forward, we going into January to March, that's where actually a lot of technical work start to happen. That's where all the county departments starting to get busy, plan out for their operation in the next year and in the next fiscal year, and then translate out of that operation into a set of budget numbers, dollars, into each account, whether if it's personnel costs, material and services, contracts, vendors, CBOs that we need to work with. All of that gets summarized into each department's, each organizational unit's functional accounts, so we can actually combine all of that, consolidate all that into a set of county budget. And throughout January to March, that's where my team works directly with the departments to put all of that together. And there's actually a lot of communications going in between it as well. And then going into April 2021, that is where we get very busy to draft the county's budget summary. If you have seen a copy of our budget summary, it actually looks like something like this. Oh, I have a virtual background, so you can't really see it. Sorry. That is a little presentation blooper with virtual backgrounds. And just keep in mind, that is actually a 300+ page document, and it's actually available on our website with PDF. So you can definitely view that anytime. And that's when we actually, in April, that's when we actually assemble this book. Because it's one thing to get a set of data, get a set of numbers into a system. It's another thing to actually pull. Yes, Victor, I'm pausing because I thought I heard a comment from someone.
Oh, sí, estoy pasando porque vi un comentario por parte de alguien.
Jack, they're just switching out interpreters.
Okay, all right, I'll continue. Thank you. And that is actually where we pull this data out of the system and then put it into a book. And there's actually a lot of publication work that goes on into the budget book. If you know, many of you may not think that, but the county actually is in quite a bit of a publication business, and for especially for my team, every spring in April we actually publish this set of books that's called a budget summary, and then every winter we actually jump in to publish another set of books called the county's CAFR, which is the annual financial report. And there's actually a lot of proofreading, a lot of publishing work, like the layout, selecting the cover, making sure that it actually gets printed out into a professional format. That is what we do in April. And then by the end of April, that's where we actually get this book published and get it out to our budget committees for review. At the same time, we also publish a public hearing notice at the end of April for May. So moving on to May, in May 2021, that's where all the public process happens. The public process includes one, a budget committee meeting. We actually do a two-part budget committee meeting. The first part, first meeting, we, as a county, the staff do a presentation to the budget committee and then explain to the budget committee of all the priorities, all the nuts and bolts that goes into the county's budget. And then the second part of the budget committee, which is scheduled on a later date in May is actually a public process. That's where the budget committee, a 10-member committee, including 5 commissioners and 5 community members, to hear the public's opinion. That is actually an open session where the public can come in and do testimonies with the budget committee. And then with the budget committee's approval of the county's budget, it move on to the June 15th, which is our target date for this current fiscal year to adopt our fiscal year 2021-22 budget adoption. So while I want to highlight that obviously we have a public involvement opportunity here with the community investment conversations, and then we have a public testimony process that goes on in May. Those are the 2 very fixed public involvement time, but that does not necessarily mean that those are the only 2 opportunities that the public can actually have discussions with commissioners, ask questions to my office or to the county administrative office to get more clarities on the county's budget, the county's priority, the county's operations. That process actually happens year-round. As Marcus mentioned earlier, he has shared our contact information. You can actually reach out to the county's commissioners, reach out to the administrative office, reach out to my office with any of your questions or any of your comments, any time of the year, to help us do a better job in interpreting the community's need. So that is the county's budget development process. I want to pause here real quick to see if there's any questions anybody have. So I think following our protocol, you can raise your hand to ask questions.
Thank you, Jack. This is Clerk Moss. We have we did have 2 people, but we have just 1 signed up so far. So it is Rena. So Rena, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
All right, please go ahead for up to 2 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hi, good evening. My name is Rena. I am a teacher in our community in a dual language program. And I just kind of wanted to express some contradictions I'm hearing. I'm hearing a lot of things about how the purpose of this conversation is to center community need, and that the board would like insight about community needs, and that they're taking steps in an effort for centering communities. And that feels sort of not congruent with what I have seen in the past, specifically in the past few months. So if there was ever, I think, a year in which government bodies would take some pretty serious action to change their budgets, it would be this year. And I've been pretty amazed by how much community input has already not been taken very seriously by this county. Specifically in August, you all held 6 sessions of community listening sessions about whether or not to allocate about $1.5 to expanding the body camera program in your sheriff's department. And what I noticed, I'm going to sort of lay out the timeline of the county's actions. So what I noticed is that initially in June, they were going to do this without research or input. And then when community organizations intervened and provided research and input saying that body-worn cameras are actually very ineffective and that it would be much more effective to invest funds into social services that would prevent crime and prevent the conditions that people to commit crimes.
Excuse me.
Then,
Rena, one quick interjection, and there's going to be an open discussion later, and I'm not trying to cut you off, but I do want people to kind of adhere to the 2-minute rule because we want to get as many in as possible. So I understand your point, but we're right at 2 minutes. So if this can be tabled and carried on later, the question that Kevin was asking was, and what Jack was asking was, did anybody have any specific response right now for the budget presentation that he had just gone through? The broader questions are to come later in the open discussion. So,
okay, can I finish in like 15 seconds?
Yeah, maybe 15 or 20 more seconds. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So that was the point when the county sought community input. Then the community input was definitively no, thank you. We want social services, not body-worn cameras. And then they sought input from the sheriff's office. So to me, it seems that the county is pretty fixed on doing what they want to do anyway, regardless of community input. And that was what I sort of wanted to point out because that's all. Thank you.
And thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Rena. And I apologize for not clarifying my question. Is actually right now, Marcus is right. I am soliciting any questions regarding the information I provided. And Marcus is right, there is actually a little time for community input and discussions. So we definitely welcome all community input and discussion in those areas. So let me clarify my question is that does anyone have any questions about the county's budget process or all of those high level budget guidance that we actually work with?
Jack, I am not seeing any hands. We have one hand raised here. Amy, please go ahead with your quick question.
Hi, yes, thanks for taking my question. My question is, it seems like you're interested in communities' input, even though maybe you don't actually follow through on the community's input. There is something that I learned about recently called participatory budgeting. And so I'm curious if that money that was going to be spent for the body-worn cameras could instead be going through the participatory budgeting process, which would be more involved than what you're doing here. It would actually involve the community members forming a committee to create the rules and then coming up with plans that could be used to spend the money, and then the community voting on it and selecting the projects. And so I'm asking whether, from your knowledge of budgeting, how we can make that happen within the county. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Amy. And my apologies, your audio was cutting in and out a little bit on my end. I don't know if it's because my device or your device, but from what I can hear, I think you're asking about the question also related with the body-worn camera program, and then as far as the resources that's budgeted for that area, if the community have any input on how to use that in other ways, what would be the right channel to provide that input for the county's current consideration
and I was
and how to
wondering,
move that needle?
Yeah, thank you. And just to clarify, there's a process called participatory budgeting. Have you heard of that process that different municipalities use?
Yeah, that is actually included as a part of Marcus' clarification at the beginning of this presentation, is that we are not there yet in terms of particular participatory budgeting, and then that is definitely obviously open for discussion anytime. As I mentioned, the input can be provided to county commissioners. But right now at this session, that's not what we're trying to conduct here in this community investment conversation. And again, I appreciate your comment, but again, it is definitely not part of the scope of my presentation here on the budget basics. So we are really trying to engage all of the community from a budget understanding first, and then move into the budget input. So if you can bear with me, bear with us, we will definitely have more of that community input conversation later. All right, anybody else that has their hand raised in particular about these questions? I want to ask Kevin before we move on to some polling questions.
Jack, I do not see any more hands raised at this moment.
And Kevin, this is Marcus. The one thing I do want to check is just if Elizabeth or Latricia, who have been monitoring the Q&A, if there were any specific questions about Jack's budget development process, and if not, then let us move on.
Yes, there was a question for Jack. What is the difference between the numbers in the budget dashboard and the budget summary?
Thank you, Latricia. That is a very good question. The budget dashboard is actually developed based on the number that's in the budget summary. So the budget summary, in a way, that is in a book, it's the same set of data, but it's in a book format where someone can actually pick up a printed book or a printed PDF to go through it and then read the budget analysis. The budget dashboard is a very data visualization driven tool, driven by the same set of data. So you should be able to reconcile the two if you are trying to compare the numbers. The only difference is with the budget dashboard, it may not necessarily have as much budget narratives that's in there that actually tells the story of why we're budgeting a certain way. So it's really more of a data-driven perspective. Although that the budget dashboard does provide another benefit, is they actually have a visualization of the county's budget process as well. It actually provides you the county's budget development, adoption season, as well as a couple of the budget adjustment processes. So it's both are catered to the particular audience that finds one more useful than the other, and obviously that we have both available just to make sure that we have multiple tools to engage with the public on the county's budget. Hopefully that answers the question. Is there any other questions I can answer, Latricia?
Not at this time.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, with that, we'll move on to the next slide, and then we'll get started with some polling questions. Hopefully that you have all been paying attention to our county's Budget 101, whether if you're a first-time attendee of this part of the presentation or you have been a repeat attendee from last year's. So we will get Kevin to help us start with the first question.
So I believe, Jack, it under this polling, it asks both questions at one time. So yeah.
Perfect. So we have two questions prepared for you for this portion of the presentation. It's one month does the county adopt the budget for the next fiscal year? And then the second one is when can the public provide input to the county's finance and budget? So please go ahead and submit your answer and then provide us your feedback. And we really appreciate your input and your participation in our presentation today.
We'll let this go about 10 more seconds here. So move over. All right, I'm going to stop the poll and I'm going to share the results here.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And wow, you guys are great. It looks like that we have 62% of the audience answered June as the county's budget adoption, and that is the correct answer. The county goes through an entire year of process and really to run to that quote unquote finish line, which is in the June budget adoption. That's where the county actually takes the budget to the Board of Commissioners and then adopt the budget. And then for the second question, you guys knocked it out of the park again. And while January, February, and March are all correct answers, looks like most of you picked year round, which is definitely the most correct answer is that you can provide input to the county's finance and budget any time of the year and by multiple channels. So very good job, audience. Thank you very much for participating with us on the poll questions. And thank you, Kevin, for facilitating that. So with that, hopefully you guys are ready to do a little deep dive into the county's budget for fiscal year 2021. And I know many of you have questions about a very complex set of budget. How do we put it together and what does it look like? What does it entail? So let me tell you that this is actually a portion where we present to the county's budget committee member every year. So it's not only something that's available as this, it's not only available as this community investment forums, but we actually have that presented as part of the budget committee process every year. And I highly encourage you to tune into that. Talking about budget committee, we actually do recruitment for the county's budget committee every year. Marcus has showed a slide earlier to share information about how to apply for our budget committee. We actually actively seek community members every year to be a part of the budget committee and really be a part of that group to review the county's budget and ask questions on behalf of the community. So I encourage all of you to, if you're interested and have the time to devote to that work, definitely apply for our budget committee that's coming up. So next slide, please. All right, so fiscal year 2020 and fiscal year 2020-2021 budget overview. Next slide, please. So to start off with the county's budget, and you can read the same information from our budget summary as well. In the beginning, where the budget message is written by the county administrator, and for fiscal year 2021, we really focused our attention in 3 areas. Keep in mind, when we were developing this budget, we were in the March-April timeline. So that was when COVID is starting to happen. We have a lot of unknowns, a lot of uncertainties, a lot of pandemic-related activities that's happening. And then, so when we develop this budget, the continuity of service is definitely a priority that was considered. And what that means is it includes COVID-19 response, includes maintaining the county's service during the pandemic. So both we want to help the community to stay safe, to practice very good public health practices, and then to control the pandemic as much as we can. But also at the same time, we recognize that our community depends on the county's regular services. So maintaining all of those regular services is one of the priorities that we are attributing to this budget. And then the second area is caution. It's looking forward into later this fiscal year, like into this winter, into the next spring, is how do we protect the ongoing support for the vital services? And that goes back to the basic services like the county's critical services in all 5 of those operating areas that I have mentioned: general government, public safety, land use transportation, housing, health and human services, as well as cultural, education, and recreation. Those are all areas of services that we're protecting, and the budget reflects that. And in addition to that, we do have priorities that has been established before the pandemic. So the whole group of pre-pandemic priorities includes the diversity, equity, and inclusion, the economic development of the county, the affordable housing, as well as the transportation. Those are 4 areas of high priorities that has not being put to the side due to the pandemic, but actually being kept as a core of the county's budget development for 2021. So next slide, please. Thank you, Chuck. All right, so let's talk about the county's total budget, and in other words, the total spent. When you look at the county family, as I was explaining earlier, we have the general fund portion, we have the special fund portion. The general fund portion and special fund portion added together, that is actually what we call total budget. So you can see, let's start with the numbers at the top. You can see comparing from 2019-20 to 2020-21, we had actually a minor decrease on both general fund side and special fund side. For the 2021 year, our total general fund budget is 320 million and some change. And then for our special fund side is actually 1.16 billion and some change in that total appropriation. So when we oftentimes talk about the county's $1.5 billion budget, that is a combination of the general fund and special fund. And keep in mind, the general fund is a discretionary part where the county has quite a bit of flexibility in terms of how do we allocate those fundings, how do we prioritize those fundings. And that portion is 320 million. And then the special funds usually are restricted, usually our external funding sources are 1.1 billion. So that's a total. Now, how is that reflected in the fiscal year 2021 county budget, right? So let's take a look at the charts at the bottom, starting from the bottom left one, and that is actually a breakdown of the county's revenue sources. You can see that we have a pretty good distribution from taxes, from intergovernmental revenue. So by the way, those intergovernmental revenue are the grants and the federal financial assistance for particular purposes. They don't actually provide financial assistance to the county to say, use it for whatever you want. Usually they come with a very specific purpose. If it's housing, if it's transportation, if it's public safety or health and human services, those fundings are very restricted. And then we have about 10%, 14% for the operating transfer yield, the charges for services, and then moving on to the smaller portions of interdepartmental fines and forfeitures, license and permits, and miscellaneous. So obviously there's a large portion of beginning fund balance is that the county actually keep a reserve on a regular basis, keep the beginning fund balance rolling forward into next year to ensure that we actually do have operating cash flows for the first couple of months of the year. Moving on to the middle chart, how do we allocate the entire portfolio? Now, keep in mind, some of that was discretionary, some of that were not. How do we allocate all of that among all of the functional areas? So we start from general fund, the general government is 13%. Public safety and justice is about 15%. Land use and transportation, 9%. Housing, health and human services, 17%. Cultural, education and recreation, 4%. And non-departmental is basically close to 0%. It's not really zero in dollar amount, but then it's really much less than a 1% mix. And then for capital spending and the non-operating, both of those are 21% of the county's total appropriation. And then the chart to the right is actually another percentage breakdown of the general fund to special fund mix for the county. You can see that the general fund is about 22%, and then the special fund is about 78%. Next slide, please. Moving on to the total spending, this is just the same story that was reflected in a chart format for 2021. You can see that all of the percentage that we mentioned is in column 3, and then they are accompanied by dollar amount that makes up that $1.5 billion budget. So this is just something for you guys' information to keep. You can see that we generally do a fairly decent job on evenly distributing out among all operating areas. Next slide, please. So I have been talking so much about the general fund, and obviously that is the area where the county commissioner can practice priorities, directions to essentially have quite a bit of discretion on how do we conduct county business. So starting on the revenue side, we actually have the revenue mix of where does the county's general fund get our resources from. The number one bucket is obviously the taxes. It's includes the property tax as well as the transient lodging tax, all kinds of taxes, as well as our county's portion of liquor tax, cigarette tax, gas tax. All of that goes into the actually not gas tax. Let me correct myself. Gas tax is part of the land use and transportation. For the revenue side, taxes is our 38% of our revenue. And then the second largest portion is the interfund and transfers. So those are actually transfers in from other funds to support general fund functions. And then we have the MISTIP and WCCLS. So MISTIP stands for Major Street Transportation Improvement Program, and WCCLS stands for Washington County Co-op Library Services. And those two are standing county priorities that is revenue that's collected on behalf of both of those programs. One is specific on transportation. The other one is specifically on our cultural education and recreation area. And then last but not least, the departmental revenue is 18%, is 18% of our funding mix. So moving on to the right-hand side of the chart, the expenditure that illustrates how we allocate our general fund expenditures. So you can see the larger portions are general government, public safety and justice, and then non-operating. Each is 23%, 31%, 32% respectively. And then our smaller portion is the housing and health and human services, 11%, and then land use and transportation, 1%, cultural education and recreation, 1%, non-departmental, 1%. Now, I know that a natural question that comes to mind is to say, why that difference in terms of how do we allocate the general fund pie? And that actually goes back to my previous comment, is to say that actually a large portion of the land use and transportation, a good portion of the housing, health, and human services, as well as a very large portion of the cultural education and recreation are all supported by general fund, are all supported by special funds. So they have very dedicated funding sources, very specific funding sources coming to fund that. That is why on the general fund piece, we actually allocate more resources toward general government and public safety and justice, where it's more in line with the general fund's spending purpose. Next slide, please. So I decided for this year that we can do a little deeper dive into each one of these operating areas. So as a community, you guys can know that within each one of these operating areas, how are we spending our money? So starting from the general government, that is where you can see a mix. Now this year is not a very typical year, and part of the reason is why because Commissioner Wheely mentioned that we received $104 million in COVID-19 CARES Act funding. So that actually took up, in this year, it took up 56% of the total general government. You can see that our general government budget is about 187%, and the CARES Act alone at the bottom of this chart on the right-hand side is 104 million. So the rest of the county's general fund is actually the other portion, and we divide it into direct services and support services. Direct services are examples like your Board of Commissioners, admin office, county council, auditors, elections, assessment, taxation, as well as equity, inclusion, and community engagement. So that whole portion makes up $26 million of our general government budget. And then support services includes our emergency management, support services admin, finance, human resources, ITS, purchasing, facility and park services, risk management, fleet services, and central services, which is our print shop and delivery. So those are actually the, you can consider them the internal operating parts that supports the rest of the county function. It's actually more or less of our back office function that supports the county's operations. And then that entire budget is 56.5 million in that area. So that is our breakdown of the general fund, general government portion. You can see that direct services is about 14% this year, support services 30%, and the COVID-19 CARES Act response fund is 56%. And the general fund special fund mix in that is the majority of this is besides the COVID-19 fund, the majority of this is the general fund of 74 million or so, and then the special fund portion is 113 million. Next slide, please. Now we move on to the public safety and justice. So this is where we actually have our 4 departments: the sheriff's office, community corrections, district attorney, juvenile services, as well as our justice court and the law library. Those are offices. And then the local option levy admin is also part of the funding mix. So you can see that we have a chart that helps you break down the dollar amounts into each one of those areas budget, as well as the general fund and special fund mix. And as I mentioned before, the public safety still have a fairly large general fund portion is because that traditionally that is a part of the operation that's supported by general fund. So the general fund portion of that is nearly $100 million, and then the special fund portion is nearly $117 million, with a total allocation of $216.6 million. So that is the picture for the public safety and justice. And then on the left-hand side, you can see that the pie chart actually breaks down the funding mix of that, starting with the sheriff's office being our largest portion of the public safety and justice at 63%, and then community corrections at 14%, district attorney at 9%, juvenile at 6%, local option levy admin at 7%, and the justice court and the law library at 1%. And then I can tell you that our public safety and justice is actually one area that takes a lot of personnel and takes a lot of work to conduct. If you feel intrigued, you can even go one step beyond into our budget summary book to look more into what each one of those funds and programs does in terms of the county's budget story as well as the operating story. Move on to the next slide, please.
And excuse me, Jack, I just want to give a time check, just we can touch base. I know you've only gone through 2 functional areas so far, but I want to make sure we have some time on the back end for people to ask questions to you and then for the later portion as well. So just touching base.
Thank you very much, Marcus. I will try to move along a little faster, and then we'll definitely leave some time for questions later. All right, moving on to the land use and transportation. That is the area where we actually have an entire department dedicated to this area. And then it's made up by divisions within our Department of Land Use and Transportation: building services, quarry planning, engineering services, long range planning, and other areas, as well as the road fund. Road fund being the largest fund under the land use and transportation. So I'm gonna let you guys read the dollar amounts in the chart by yourself. You can see that how big of a difference between general fund and special fund difference. General fund is about $4 million. Special fund is $126 million. And obviously, on the left-hand side, you also have a chart that helps break down the percentage of each one of those areas and what are those services that we provide to the county. Now, next slide, please. And then housing, health, and human services. So this includes a couple different departments, multiple service areas. Again, we have followed the same format. You can see that the larger portion of that is our human services, including 40%. Our housing is about 41% of that mix, and then followed by public health being 10%. Smaller portions in aging and veteran services, animal services, community development, as well as HHS, which is our health and human services admin function in there. You can also see the dollar amounts on the right-hand side. General fund portion is close to $35 million. Special fund portion is $216 million, with a total appropriation of 251. So next slide, please. And the fifth of our operating functional area is cultural education and recreation. So starting with, this is where we have our library services, where we have our parks, where we have our fair complex, where you actually, if you have been to our county fair, that is the organization unit that hosts that as well. So in this area, we have our agricultural service area, fair complex, library, parks, transit and lodging tax. You can see that we also have the budget that's laid out on the right-hand side in the dollar amount with a $64.8 million in total for these functional areas. And then the general fund portion of this is $2.3 million. Special fund is $62.4 million, with the libraries obviously being the largest portion of this functional area. Next slide, please. And then we move on to the non-operating side of the budget. I combined the capital, non-departmental, and the non-operating section all together. So starting with the capital, we have our capital facilities, capital information technology, transportation, and you can see that those are the areas. And you'll probably notice that the largest portion of our capital is actually our transportation. So that is a part of the reflection of the county's commitment and priority to a good transportation system within Washington County. And our non-operating is $320 million. That is a large portion as well, which takes up 51%. And then the non-departmental is $3.2 million. And the general fund portion of this mix is $93 million. And then the special fund portion is $539 million. Next slide, please. So we do have some additional information. If I know that it's a very little time for us to cover the county's budget from cover to cover. So if you need additional information, you can come to our website. So next slide, I have some examples for you. So on our main page, under the county's homepage, there is a left-hand side navigation panel. And one of those options in there is called the financial information. And I also provided a link on this slide for you to that you can actually click to get to that information. And that is actually a page that has the county's budget in much more detailed format, as well as the county's reporting. It's because the budget is just the county's plan, and then the county's financial reporting actually reflects on how the county actually spend the money in the end. We all know that we spend under the budget because we are compliant with the Oregon budget law, but then when we actually do the spending, oftentimes, like there are areas where we spend a little more, areas spend a little less within that umbrella. How does the county do that line of business? That information is there. Next slide, please. And then in addition to that, some of you have asked that question already, is what's the difference between the Washington County's budget dashboard versus the county budget summary? And again, the budget summary is a book format for people to really read the stories behind the scenes. The dashboard is designed for our data folks to really see the county's budget data visualization in a very graphic format. So this is just one example, one part of the budget dashboard as a visual on the screen. And then you can click on the link below to see the county's budget dashboard. That will give you a lot of drilling capabilities to get more information. So that is our way of providing more information to you as a self-service kind of guide. But keep in mind that I am always available to answer any questions for you. If you reach out to me by phone or email, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions and provide any clarifications. Next slide, please. With that, we'll open up questions and comments for this portion of the evening. Do you have any questions or comments in terms of the county's budget development process, as well as the county's fiscal year 2021 budget mix?
All right, Jack, we have 2 hands raised so far, so I will let the first person talk. Benjamin, can you hear us? You were muted, Benjamin.
Hello?
Yeah, please go ahead with your question.
Good evening. I'm sure you guys are all aware the county strives for providing a safe place to live. Unfortunately, I don't really feel like it's safe for all people. In the past 10 years, between 2009 and 2019, pedestrian deaths on U.S. roadways have increased by 60%. As a person who drives, rides my bike, and walks and takes the bus to work, this is really concerning. On the occasion that I walk or ride my bicycle, I either witness or encounter a situation that comes extremely close to the death of a person. This has happened reliably every single day I make my way to work. Aside from more public safety announcements and increased policing, which have been shown to be ineffective solutions, what is the county's plan for allocating funding to mitigate this issue and providing safer infrastructure? I've been told by the roads department that there is no funding for this, so I'm coming to you, even though that they are spending over $280 million per year in capital. I should not have to worry about getting killed on my way to work.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. Thank you for that comment. It sounds like it's more of a comment rather than question. So we're definitely taking note of all the questions and comments that we're taking at this session, and then pass that on to the relevant department. And as part of my earlier presentation, I want to encourage you to continue to engage with our county commissioners, county administrative office. For your particular topic, it looks like that it's more geared toward the land use and transportation area. And I know that we both work within the county and our city partners to ensure that we have a safe transportation environment for everybody. And that may just be an area that we need to understand a little more of the concern in our land use and transportation. So we'll definitely take note of that and pass that on, but at the same time, want to encourage you to engage with our particular departments on that. I want to see if Chair Harrington or Commissioner Willie has any comment toward this particular comment.
Thank you, Brian, for your comment. There are funds going towards pedestrian and bicycle safety from the capital budget as well as other aspects of the budget. But your point is very well taken, that we have more need than we have been able to catch up on. So thank you for your comment.
All right, next up we have Kathy. Kathy, please unmute.
Yes.
All right, go ahead.
I have two quick questions. One is, does the transportation part of the budget include public transportation and also include bridges, fixing bridges? And the second question is, do individual towns add to the library budget?
I'm sorry, Cassie, I missed, I'm not sure if I understood fully your second question. Can you repeat that real quick?
Yeah, do individual towns contribute more to the libraries than the county has it in their budget? Do the towns also?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think I understand your question now. So I'm going to start with your first question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. I'll start with your first question. Is our transportation budget actually, when you refer to public transportation, I think you might be referring to public, like buses, bus lines, or
yes,
the rails. So I want to tell you that our budget, while that we have a large portion on the road fund, but also at the same time with part of our capital budget, with part of our engineering, we actually work in partnerships. So our partners are the city partners, but also at the same time, TriMet is one of our partner as well. So when we look at efforts, for example, like working on a new transit center or all of those areas, we actually do have a budget and county operations that's dedicated to those efforts. We may not necessarily be building those rails ourselves because that's primarily TriMet's work, right? But we actually provide a whole lot of partnership and wraparound operations to support those efforts when it falls within the Washington County area. And then we continuously work with our city partners to work on roads, traffic signals, as Chair Harrington mentioned, the bicycle safety, bicycle transit, so all of that. When we look at the county's transportation, we actually look at it as a whole, but then we do engage with different partners that specialize in different areas on those operations. Did that answer your first question? I want to do a quick check.
Yes, that was good. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. And then your second question about library is the county, Washington County has a co-op library model. Actually, each city, each town, actually, when they are part of the member library, they actually do dedicate their resources toward the library's operation as well. We provide a good portion of the funding mix to each one of the member libraries. Some of them are city libraries, some of them are community not-for-profit libraries. But oftentimes each one of those libraries have another portion of their funding source, whether it's coming from the city or it's coming from a not-for-profit funding source. And I also wanted to pass it on to Chair Harrington and Commissioner Willie to see if you guys have any comments on these two questions.
Nope, for the sake of time, I think you did a good job, Jack. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair Harrington.
And with that comment in mind, I was just about to step in. For the sake of time, I'm gonna ask Kevin to just keep track of anybody else who still had a question, and we're gonna go ahead and kind of blast through the next section because I do want to save the bulk of our time for the broader conversation. So some of the questions that you might have had for Jack, if you could continue just to hold them and get through this, and we're gonna go through this next section because one of the most important things that your commissioners wanted to achieve tonight was they wanted to hear what things you want to uplift, what things you want to decrease, and that's the bulk of our remaining conversation. So I'm going to go through a couple of quick items, but before I do want to do one quick check for Christina, again, just to make an announcement. If anybody came late and needed to go to the Spanish channel, if you could just update us one more time on that before I go forward.
Of course. Gracias por acompañarnos esta tarde. Si quiere accesar esta conversación en español, puede elegir el canal de español por la pantalla de Ciclo de Mundo, por abajo de su pantalla. Elige ese canal y puede usted hacer preguntas por el chat. Y si quiere hacer una declaración en voz alta, puede hacer su declaración para hasta 2 minutos en español y será traducida en inglés. Gracias.
Gracias, Christina. And, a couple of things. I would ask Chuck to pull up slide 34 for now. But while he's doing that, I just wanted to reiterate to everybody, I know what Jack just gave you was a lot of information. It's a lot to process. There will be opportunities to engage later on in this brief program, but also your county lives in the county. They're there all the time. So please use them, your commissioners, the CFO, everybody at the county, and they can go into these deeper dives to answer some of these questions. Jack mentioned sometimes budgets change. Sometimes they will change because of the community feedback you're going to give today. Sometimes they change because of things we have no control over, like the wildfires or the expenses went up for community for emergency management. So just be aware that part of this process is going to be unsatisfactory. I think I said earlier, we may have to accept some non-closure on some of these issues, but I still want us to get through as many of the things that are important to you right now. I just put that up so you all could remember the purpose of tonight. And then the next slide, Chuck, if you would, just a reminder about the conversations coming up next. So the first thing I want to do is have a couple of polls. These are going to be a couple of quick polls because what I wanted to do, you saw the 5 functional areas that the county's discretionary budget encompasses that Jack talked about. And I wanted to find out from you all, everybody listening, we wanted to find out from everybody listening, what are you prioritizing? So again, at the end of this conversation, we might not be going down chapter and verse into the areas, the specific sub area you might care the most about, but what your commissioners want to hear as part of this process is generally where you're going to land, what is most important to you as a community. So if we could start with, not even the poll yet, the slide on the budget versus the next slide, I'm sorry. The budget versus household budget, and just as a bit of framing. On this slide, to the left is everything you've just heard about. The county's budget, the county's functional area budget, the 5 functional areas. And what we've tried to do here is just put you in the frame of mind that just like the county has a budget, they have to balance it. Many of us have budgets. Many of us have to balance it. And when it doesn't play out, we go into the negative. So, but the county has to consider the same areas we're considering: supplies and equipment, public safety versus your own home safety, land use and transportation. We have to figure out how to get to work and how to get the kids to school. health and human services, housing. Many of us in the real world have to spend much of our money on rent and mortgage. So I just wanted to throw this up here as an example to let you know that the very things you're considering, the county is considering, and how you slice up the pie is really going to matter. Next slide, please. Speaking of slicing up the pie, this is what you heard again from Jack. This is just the percentage basis, but what Jack showed you before was the differences between the special fund and the general fund. What this slide is the total fund. So, we're spending on public safety and justice about 15% of the overall special and general fund budget in the county. For housing, health, and human services, about 17% of the budget, and so on. But what I want to do, and to Jack's point, is that you look at your total budget, they're looking at the total budget. Next slide, please. And before I show you the polling, I wanted to remind you of this slide that Jack showed you before about all the functional areas that are going on in the county. So these are the 5 areas, and this is what makes it up. For example, we can look at public safety. Well, public safety is just not the sheriff. It is the sheriff and the juvenile courts and the DA and the jails and the corrections and the law library. So there's a lot of pieces for that. Same with housing, health, and human services. Housing is a big chunk. Public health is a big chunk. Human services are a big chunk, but there's a lot of other pieces that go in there as well. So when you're making when we go through this poll, which is going to follow immediately, when you're making these decisions, think about all these pieces that make it up. So when you land on general government or land on land use and transportation as what you want to increase or decrease, keep these areas in mind. And so with that frame, I want you all to get ready to take another poll. And I will ask Kevin to throw out the poll, to start the poll. And then after this poll, we're gonna begin our discussion. So on this poll, and for the people who are on the phone, the question is simply, of the 5 functional areas, pick the top 2 areas that you want to focus on at this time. It's a multiple choice, so please pick your top 2 areas, and we're going to try to see what the people on this particular call, it may be different for a different group, but what you all are thinking tonight about what you want your county to focus on at this time. And we're going to give it about 20 more seconds, and then we'll end the poll and see where you land, because I have a follow-up question for you as well. So it's slowing down. So let's end the poll. And so on this slide, the top 2 answers are housing, health, and human services, and public safety and justice. And so we'll move on to the next question, which you might surmise is, of the 5 functional areas, pick the top, or of the 2 highest that you've selected, pick the top 2 that you want to focus on. If you could go to the next poll, I'm sorry, poll 2. Yeah, if you could only choose one of the functional areas, I said it a little differently, but if you could only choose one of these areas, what would you focus on as a community? And so we'll let this come in. And it's slowing down. And so that was consistent with—
Marcus,
yes.
I'm so sorry, it's Elizabeth. I've got a question in the Q&A.
Yes.
One of the participants wants to know, when we ask for prioritizing, is it prioritizing in terms of increased spending or prioritizing for discussion even to decrease?
Funny they should ask, because that is going to be the next section. Right now, the answer is both. What you care, if you care more strongly to decrease something, well, then that should be your selection. If you care more strongly to increase something, that should be your selection. But our next exercise, and what we're going to try to walk you through with these answers, is we want to find out exactly what you think that is. And there will be an option for you to suggest what you want to increase and what you want to decrease. So we have, so what came out of that exercise was the fact that housing, health, and human services, for plus or minus, was what people were most interested in this one snapshot poll of seeing change, and public safety and justice came next. But what we're going to do, we're going to concentrate on housing, health, and human services. But now we have one more poll for you, and I think Glenn is going to put that up. I think Kevin is going to put that poll up.
Yes, Marcus, and this poll is the budget revision. So it has 5 questions on the functional areas that Mr. Lang went over for the public to talk about increasing the budget, no change, and decreasing the budget, and what the public feels about that.
That's exactly right. So on this, you can see the first question deals with general government. The next question deals with public safety and justice. The next question deals with land use and transportation. The next question deals with housing, health, and human services. And the next question deals with culture, education, and the recreation budget. But as you answer each question, you're answering each one individually. So if you want a gigantic increase in general government, you would answer significantly increase the budget. If you wanted that to stay the same, you would say no change. If you wanted a moderate decrease, you would say that. So even though this is 5 separate questions, answer each one individually, and then we will tabulate the responses about where people collectively think they want to increase, they suggest the commissioners decrease, or they leave the same. An example I would give is that if you think your county is not spending enough on housing right now, we'll say moderately increase or significantly increase the housing piece. And because your county has to balance the budget, you might suggest that they decrease a different area. Well, you might, for that one, you might say moderately or significantly decrease that area. These are the decisions your commissioners have to make every day as they're creating these budgets and their staff, but they want this input from you. So
Marcus, there's a question about showing the slide that shows the dollar amounts or the funding amounts for each area, which might help people answer the poll.
Okay, well, we can go back to the slide that has the actual dollars on there.
I think it's just that pie chart, Mark.
Maybe the pie chart is fine.
Pie chart with the percentages. Okay,
yes.
That's should just be 1 or 2 slides back of the total planned spending slide. Yeah, total planned expenditure. So this is a percentage. This is not the actual dollars amount, but assume this is a $1.5 billion budget that you're talking about. These are the relative expenditures in each one. Now, the purpose of the exercise we are trying to do, we don't have the time, and I don't have the expertise to go through the granular dollar amounts on each area, but we did just want to know directionally, you as a county resident, what more do you want your commissioners to do? Because as I mentioned at the very, very, very beginning, this is a planning exercise, but this is also a values exercise. By you telling the commissioners what you value, what you want to uplift, and what you want to decrease, you're helping them make decisions for the county. So I hope by putting this slide up, though, it did respond to the individual who reached out to you, Latricia.
And looks like we've slowed down, so I'll share these results here.
Okay. All right. Well, and while these, so these are the immediate results, and we're going to input this into another chart as part of the answer to give a visual for what you all are seeing. But immediately, I will quickly review the what changes would you make to the general government budget. The heaviest answer was no change. The biggest change for public safety and justice was to decrease. The biggest change for land use was no change. The biggest change for housing, health, and human services was significantly increased with all the sub-departments that encompasses. And people wanted to significantly increase culture, education, and recreation. So what we're going to do with that information is we're going to put it on our next slide for discussion. But while the team is compiling that, I wanted to open it up again for our general discussion. We have about a half an hour left on this call. And so the balance of the time we wanted to spend hearing more either about Jack's presentation, about some of the specific things that you wanted to uplift about the county budget, answering specific questions, and the people that raised their hand earlier, I'm sure that Kevin still has that listing and he may call them out in sequence. But even before we get to that portion, I wanted to take a pause here and ask any of the commissioners on the line if they wanted to reflect back on an earlier question or about any of the process tonight before we start hearing from us residents in the county. I'll start with Chair Harrington.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite follow that.
No, that's okay. We're at a pause now. We're about to hear from the county residents about anything and everything. But before we did that, I just wanted to know if either you or any of the other commissioners wanted to weigh in about anything that has preceded this or anything that you wanted to prime the pump for what we hear next.
No, I don't think so at this point. It is our first one of these, so we're figuring out the logistics. And unfortunately, the way the logistics are set up, I think I'm the only one who's still on as a panelist to respond to that request. So, but no, I think we're all here with open ears, wanting to hear and learn more from our community.
Well, very good. Then I will.
Actually, Marcus, if I could jump in a little bit. This is Jerry Willie. I am on board. I'm just not visual. I'm remote on my phone, and I have been listening as well. I would agree and try and emphasize the things that you've been emphasizing, which is that this is a process where we want to hear. I think the polling is going to be very newsworthy, I think, to me, to understand where the priorities of our constituents are. And at the same time, trying to find a balance for what we know is going to be a very difficult budget season, primarily due to reduced revenues, not only from the state, which provides funding for many of our juvenile and jail facilities, revenue as well. So we're going to need to go about this very meticulously, but I am very interested in the polling results and see how we can apply that. So thank you, Marcus.
Thank you, Commissioner. And with that,
y con eso.
Oh, that is the interpreter. Okay. With that, I would like to ask Kevin if anybody was queued up and having raised their hand, and also Latricia and Elizabeth. If I haven't read the Q&A, but I see there are some things in the Q&A. If one of those questions need to be surfaced for the good of the group.
I have a couple of questions if you want to take a couple from the question and answer box.
Absolutely.
Sure. Someone would like to hear more about how COVID may affect our budgets in the next year, and that included in facilities as well as programmatic responses.
And here, I think it's both the chair, Commissioner Willie and Jack. I'll let them decide.
Why don't I take a stab at that? This is one of our worst fears. We are in a new frontier. The funding through Congress and the U.S. Treasury, known as the CARES Act, The funds that we've been provided both here directly at Washington County as well as to the state have to be spent by December 30th of this year. And that's it. So the $104 million that we've been putting into action to fund the increased public health services that our community has needed, to help provide sustaining dollars to our business community, and onward and onward. That money has to be spent by the end of the year, and then it's done. So this is why we have been lobbying our congressional delegation to really get another funding package available, because your local government doesn't have enough resources to keep all of these services going, as well as respond to your needs in this global pandemic. It's terrifying. At the same time that our infection rates are skyrocketing. It's a pretty terrifying time to be a commissioner right now. Commissioner Willie also mentioned that due to the economic crisis that is associated with this public health crisis, the revenue that the state passes through to counties like Washington County to provide various health and human services is at risk as well. So we're pretty worried. It is going to be a very difficult budget for us next fiscal year, but for the second half of this current fiscal year, January through June, we're also very worried. We may have to make some very difficult choices about our workforce, about curtailing certain services, because we know certain areas like public health are vital right now. It's a very uncertain future, as uncertain as I've ever seen it in my 14 years of being an elected official, and that includes during the Great Recession. I'm sorry, I'm not providing you with the message of hope. We're running very fast towards a cliff at the end of this year. Please write to every congressional person in our nation to let them know that your needs need to be met.
Well, that didn't sound very hopeful for the second tranche of funding, but thank you for the reality check, Chair Harrington.
Marcus, I do have a couple other questions, and they're both were focused on the small proportion of the pie that's focused on culture, education, and recreation. And so there's questions about why is that funding amount so small? And in one question, why is it so small in comparison to capital, non-departmental, and non-operating expenses?
I can take a crack at that if you'd like.
I was hoping a commissioner or Jack could weigh in on that, so thank you, Chair.
We don't operate cultural venues directly here in Washington County. The portion of our general fund does go right to the cultural organizations here in the county, such as Tualatin Valley Creates. Then we also have a collaboration going with RAC, the Regional Arts and Cultural Commission, but we don't run such programs directly. So there are limited funds that have historically been directed towards this category, and we have continued those funds. But it isn't a major program area for county government. Certainly, culture, education, and recreation is a big part of what we value in our greater community. It's just not a standard county service. Cities have larger investments in this area, and then others as well. It's just not a primary one for us.
Commissioner Willie, is there anything you'd like to add? Nope. So, all right.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Kevin. Latricia, you sounded as if you had a few more questions, or was that it?
I think that might be it. It was just that there were two different questions that came in specifically about the culture, education, and recreation. So thank you.
Very good. Kevin, did we have anybody in the queue?
Yes, we do. We have 4 people in the queue, and then following that, I have 2 written questions that came in. So we will start with Maggie. Can you hear us, Maggie?
Yes, hi. So I just have a comment and a question. So this is actually from the budget dashboard. We talked a lot about percentages here, and I just wanted to point out that the actual dollar amounts for the 2020-21 general fund budget is nearly $100 million for public safety and justice, and nearly $35 million for housing, health, and human services. I know somebody had asked about specific dollar amounts earlier. So those are kind of the specific dollar amounts. And then my question is, how open is Washington County to participatory budgeting for the next fiscal year? Because it kind of seems like you're leaning in that direction. And that would be really cool. So I guess that's my main question. Thank you.
I can take a crack at that latter question. Sorry for the tongue twisting. Participatory budgeting is a technique that many of us have been learning more about in municipal government finance for a number of years. It is somewhat relatively new for jurisdictions here in Oregon. It's something that we are very interested in possibly doing in the future. We're having a little difficulty getting our head around it at this stage of the game because of all of the budget challenges that we're facing. But there is hope for that. We have a new county administrative officer, Tanya Angie. She brings to us a different level of experience. Our interim CAO, Stephen Rhodes, coming from city government down in California, he had direct experience with participatory government, budgeting, in government. So I look forward to us looking out in future years to figure out how we might go about that, whether we target a specific portion of our budget or a functional area of our budget or something larger. It's just not something that we are prepared to be able to do right now, particularly as we are just absolutely scrambling in continuing our current services while also meeting the demand in our community to deal with this public health crisis, with this new coronavirus, COVID-19, as well as the economic crisis. That's it for now.
All right. Next up, we have Melissa. Melissa, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks. I just had a comment. I believe one of the top priorities for a county is to protect all of its residents. We need to feel safe and secure. And that we don't want to have the Portland riots here in Washington County. I don't want to be scared for my life. And that means we need to fully fund and support the sheriff's office. So I just want to get that point across, that I believe in the sheriff's office. I believe in safety and security for all Washington County residents. Also, with regard to the body worn cameras that was mentioned earlier, they are effective. Contrary to the other lady's comment, they make officers act better. They make the public act better. And with everyone live streaming on their own phones, when a situation occurs, we need to see all views of that situation, including the law enforcement officer's view. We want to make sure every view gets counted so we really understand what happened. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Melissa. Next up, Sal, can you hear us? Sal, you have to unmute there.
There, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Sal DeGrande, and I want to comment on public safety and back up what Melissa just stated. The citizens of Washington County for many years have supported public safety, both in ESPD and local option safety levies. And I would want that to continue and grow. Wherever a community decides to defund the police by either a portion, 10, 20%, crime goes up. And I never want to see that happen in Washington County. I understand the compassion for housing, health, and human services. People are questioning why don't we spend more money there versus public safety. But the bottom line, the fundamental issue here is you can't have a safe housing, health, and human services operating within a county unless you have public safety. Now, this is directed towards Chair Harrington and also a comment regarding Commissioner Treese. You have both endorsed Reimagine Oregon, where they are lobbying strongly to defund the police. Could you please explain to me why you did that? And will you continue to work to defund the police as they are advocating and as you endorsed, or will you change your mind?
I think a point of clarification is in order. Commissioner Treese and I were invited to participate in the set of meetings that Reimagine Oregon had. And we worked with our staff to provide responses to the questions that the Reimagine Oregon group had. I believe firmly in that Black Lives Matter and want to see my community as a whole, our community, improve. And so, like Commissioner Treese, I participated by listening. And we as a commission have had one work session where we've heard from Reimagine Oregon, but we have not at all come back to talk about what do these proposals from this outside group mean? What might we consider? So please know that we participated, but that's not to say that we endorsed all of the recommendations from Reimagine Oregon. I hope that provides some good clarity.
All right. Thank you, Chair Harrington. Next, we have Shashmita. Shashmita, can you hear us?
Sushmita, if you would just hold one moment. This is Marcus. I just did want to get an update because Commissioner Treese is listening on a different channel, but she supported what the chair was saying, and she just reflected that it's important to know what the region was thinking. The commission will continue to work together to try to resolve these issues. So she just wanted to be heard from. She is not on this channel, she is on another channel, and I thought I would share that. Now, my good friend Sushmita, if you would.
Thank you so much, Marcus and commissioners and everyone at the county and everyone listening in. So many thoughts about this budget and the process with which it has been developed. I do not feel that the community input, like 7 people do not decide a county budget or do not, if they do not have lived experiences, they can't truly suggest budgets for the county for all 700,000 people that live in this county. Secondly, when I think it is time that we start rephrasing the word public safety. We had 6 sessions where where the consensus was that police do not come before the crime. The crime happens and police come to take notes of it. So yes, public safety is extremely important. So we need to ensure that our communities have the resources and the support they need to ensure that that we do not have crime. We, for thousands of years, we are trying to correct problems. We are promising people, we will give you housing, we'll give you food, we'll give you this, we'll give you that. How about we are proactive with our budget and say that we will build all of these resources and then see how much policing do we really need in the first place when people have shelter, when they have food, when they have accessibility, when they have where there's arts and culture. We don't have a culture where we are connected. Sherwood to Gaston to Banks to Bethany, all of those are not connected. We don't know what each person's experiences. People, we are all living with our own privileges, and some of us are not. So until we are connected, how will we ever understand? So public safety is not public safety, it's policing. And the judicial system, which, for how many more people and organizations do we need telling us that it is not working? So how do we reimagine it and completely do something different to ensure that people feel safe, that we don't have a circumstance of extreme crime? Some crime will exist, but majority of it, we know, is very, very basic stuff that ruins people's lives. And people, I can't imagine waking up. I have a privilege of being a woman, of being a brown-skinned woman, a light brown-skinned woman. And I can't imagine being that mother waking up every morning not knowing whether her child is going to come back alive at night. And it's thank you. So let's start using real words. Public safety should be public safety, not policing.
I appreciate that. And I want to continue this because we've only gotten a few comments in, but before we continue, I wanted to take a pause here before we start losing people. And two things. One, I would ask people's forbearance. If we go a few minutes over, I hope you can still stay with us. But before people have to start leaving, I did want to show the results of the poll that you all participated in, and then we can finish our discussion as we wind up, if that's all right with everybody. So if you would, Kevin and or Glenn, I don't know who is in charge of this, but I did want to share the poll. So the last poll that you all entered, and I do not want to disrupt, but I do want you to see what you all said collectively before everybody goes. The last poll where we looked at the 5 functional areas: general government, public safety, land use, housing, health and human services, and culture, education, and recreation. The general consensus from, admittedly, there's about 50 people in this group. You came back with the people voted and said, let us decrease what we are calling today, Sushmita, public safety and justice, and they wanted to increase overwhelmingly housing, health, and human services, and significantly culture, education, and recreation services. So, this is just the immediate response. And then general government and land use and transportation wound up kind of in the middle areas. So clearly, with the people on this call, they want to see a decrease in the public safety and justice funding, and they want to see an increase in HHS, housing, health, and human services, and culture, education, and recreation. We don't have to have a separate discussion about that. I just wanted you to be aware of that in case it would temper or add to the conversation that we're going to have for the next 10 or 15 minutes before we close it down. And I will stay as long as anybody wants, but I want to be respectful of people's time. So Kevin, I would just ask that we go back to whoever is next in your queue and we have a bit of that discussion as well. And one last thing is, all this information, even this summary, will be available on the county website. I don't know where it's going to land yet, whether the CFO or the commission, but we will have the information available to the public if you need some time to ruminate about it.
All right, thank you, Marcus. We have no one else in the queue. One of the written questions is answered, so let me ask the second question. Why has the county prioritized the Sheriff's Office public safety over health, housing, and human services in the 2021 budget? Will the county commit to switching this in the general fund for 21-22 using the 2021 budget? This would mean move about 65 million of the general fund from public safety Sheriff's Office into the health, housing, and human services budget for the 21-22 budget. So that is all I have there. I don't know, Chair Harrington, did you have any comments at all, or Jack?
Well, this is an area where if people had heard me on the campaign trail, as well as my almost 2 years now of being on the commission, I pointed out that for a long time, the Washington County Commission had an adopted financial policy of only funding health and human services utilizing the money that the state provided it, or that our staff was able to get grant funding through, for example, federal programs, housing and urban development, or the federal housing administration, or through the state. And general fund dollars were kept as much as a minimum as possible, generally only used to provide for local match. This is an area where I've been talking about looking at community need as opposed to saying, well, identifying through the budget process, well, there's this additional funding that we have, where might we spend it? And this is where I have really pushed for us to change our budgeting process, to hear more from you about community need. To be clear, we have great staff here who know how to provide services. We are blessed that you, as the voters, have approved 2 new funding measures for affordable housing and supportive housing services. This will help us increase the number of people that we're able to serve, to get off the streets, to help our chronically homeless and disabled community members, and to get them into stable housing with the support they need, whether it's on financial planning and handling, whether it's behavioral health, mental health, or addiction services. We have great staff that have been working on proposals and bringing those forward. Now, unfortunately, we're dealing with a global pandemic, a lack of a national response and strategy. So our governor has been doing everything possible that she can. And we have now an economic crisis. So I want us to move forward more, but we're going to be dealing with contracted dollars now, fewer revenues than we've had than ever before. So I'm hoping we won't have to go backwards. But this is definitely an area that I've been championing, that we need to do more.
Thank you, Chair Harrington. Marcus?
Kevin, could I weigh in? Kevin,
yes, you can,
am I
Commissioner.
unmuted?
You are.
All right. Thank you. This is Commissioner Willie. When we talk about a redesign of our public safety, that is well embraced, I believe, by everyone, including our sheriff. But that are the people that we interact with, whether they be our mental.
You are breaking up just a bit, Commissioner Willie.
Pardon me?
You were breaking up just a bit, at least on my end, towards the end.
All right, I'm sorry. So I just wanted to emphasize to that person who wants us to slash $65 million out of the police budget. There's a whole bunch of analogies that I could use as to why that would not be a good idea, but rest assured that we are looking at not only how to maximize our health and human services money that we have available, but also how to maximize our public safety dollars and how we blend those two together to make sure that we are taking care of our needs. Also remember that in May, we passed a Here Together homeless initiative that is going to provide not as much money as what they had originally projected because of the pandemic, but it's going to provide a fairly significant amount of money. And a lot of that money is going to be directed at mental health services. So we are in the process of creating a document that will outline how we spend that money, how that money will be allocated to the 3 counties. But we have an opportunity to have additional monies for exactly this problem. So I want you to stay tuned and pay attention to how that, what the results of that are. But rest assured, this is a top priority for us as well.
All right, and this is Marcus, the facilitator. I have a comment from Commissioner Treese, and then we'll start winding down. But the comment from Commissioner Treese is simply that our budgeting system is becoming more dynamic. It's consistent with what Commissioner Willie said and Chair Harrington. As evidenced here tonight, while we can't commit to specific changes tonight, please continue to provide the Commission with your thoughts and by specific changes in terms of flipping budget allotments. That's not going to happen tonight, but what I would remind everybody, and what you've heard several times, is this is an iterative process. Tonight, one of my earlier slides said, accept non-closure. We're not going to resolve all the answers tonight, and this is just the first of 4, which is also just the first of a series of community opportunities to input and share their thoughts with the commissioner. So I do want you to remember that. And also, as Commissioner Willie mentioned, yeah, Measure 26210 was a permanent supportive housing and homelessness measure that had a lot of wraparound services built in, some of the very social services that came up several times tonight. Had Measure 26218 passed for transportation, you would have seen more money for the gentleman that was talking about how unsafe the roads were. There would have been more money for that. That didn't pass. Your county was on board with it, but that doesn't mean that they're not looking for alternatives to fill in the gaps. And even something like the second tranche of federal funding, it might not come, it portends not to come before the end of the year, but hopefully in the next part of the early part of next year, that'll come through. I say those things not to advocate for your commissioners. They can fight for themselves. What I'm saying is these budgets change all the time, but what they want to receive from you all is input to help them make those decisions. When they come to those decision points, they will know what the county is prioritizing. So that's what I hope this exercise was tonight. You saw the results of the polling. The only thing left I have to say is perhaps just the wrap-up themes were that there's a lot of different opinions in your county, commissioners, and this is just the first of 4. The next session is on Monday, the following session is on Wednesday, and the following session is on a Saturday. I know not everybody on this call got all of their questions answered, but what I do hope is that you continue to follow up with Jack Leung, with your commissioners, with the staff that have been supporting this call to get the information out there and to get the answers that you need. I had a couple of other bullets, but while I'm digging those up, I will ask the commissioners who are still on the line. There is one raised hand, so I will ask that person to weigh in. But beyond once Kevin lines that person up, right after that, I will ask the commissioners to say any parting words they have, and then we'll go ahead and shut it down. And if I forget, the moment we all leave this meeting, you should get a survey following this meeting. I think it's a 1-question survey. Please answer that to let us know your thoughts. So, Kevin, can you?
Yes, I can, Marcus. Kathy, can you hear us? Kathy, you are muted there. Can you hear us?
Yes. Am I unmuted now?
You are. Please go ahead.
Oh, great. Well, first of all, I want to thank you so much, and especially you, Commissioner Harrington, to be determined to work on health and human services. But of course, the whole commission had to work on it to get where you are. Please do not rest on your laurels. We have a long way to go. And in my great experience, many years, if when people are determined, they get it done. And you can have all kinds of reasons not to finish it up. But if you're determined, it gets done. So please do that. We want our communities to be safe for every child, parent, and person. So important. Thank you.
All right, back to you, Marcus.
That's a very positive way to close, but I'm not going to close. I'm going to pass it to the commissioners. Chair Harrington.
Thank you, Marcus. I want to make note, I believe through this program series that our staff is noting all of the questions that you've been asking through the Q&A forum. And if your questions are not answered tonight, they will be following up to the best that they're able through the process, if they have contact information for you. But at a minimum, they will be providing answers through the final report that we as the board will be receiving. I hope that our staff will be able to get to that before the end of the year, which there are only about 4 more work weeks left in the year. We'll see, but I remain hopeful. So in closing, I want to say thank you very much for participating with us tonight, for learning more about our large $1.5 billion budget with about $320 million of discretionary funds. I appreciate Jack's effort to break that large budget down into something more digestible for all of us, and for us to hear one another's questions. And thank you so much for being here.
And Commissioner, before we hear from Commissioner Willie to truly close us out, I would be remiss if I did not let my District 2 Commissioner have her comments shared with the group, which is, please thank all of the participants for their engagement. She does not intend to rest, but in fact feels more energized by this discussion. That is from District 2 Commissioner Pamela Treese.
And Marcus, we did get a comment from Commissioner Rogers from District 3. He also expresses his thanks and was listening in, and he looks forward to his next Wednesday night. So Commissioner Willie?
Yes, thank you. I'm hoping that I've hit the unmute button correctly. So am I good, Kevin?
You are good.
Okay. Yeah, I would like to echo the same thing as the other commissioners. We don't get the option of resting on our laurels because there isn't anything to rest on, quite frankly. We have got a lot of work to do, and we know that. I think the important thing is there's a saying that I used several years ago when I was mayor, and it was, we can't let the tyranny of the or get in the way of and. And what that means is we are not going to be making choices of A or B. We are going to find a way to blend and to make our budget work and to find resources and ways to get the job done, regardless of how serious this pandemic is. We are all very committed to be successful in getting our economy and certainly getting our county through a very, very difficult time. So thank you again for your input tonight, and stay tuned with us because we've got a lot of work to do and we need your support. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank everybody for coming, and you all have a great evening. Good night.
Stay healthy, everyone.
Yes, please stay healthy. Thank you, interpreter. I was just tired watching your hands move. Oh my goodness.